Welcome to the Radius of Reason. I'm Levon with my co-host
Andre.
Radius of Reason is a podcast about basically everything
And nothing at the same time. That was a good attempt. We did as good of an attempt as possible in an intro.
No, this is what it's about. We're not clipping this out. This is actually going into the episode.
This is live.
Shit.
We got it. Let's rescue it.
This is it.
This is it.
All right.
We are here.
It is a podcast about politics, current events, philosophy, science, psychology, anthropology, evolutionary.
Don't do the accent. Don't do the accent.
That's not even an accent.
I saw where you were going with that.
That's raw emotion. This is...
Welcome back to the Radius of Reason, everybody. We're going to be breaking from our normal format this time around to spend some time discussing current events.
What are we starting off with?
What have you been reading about lately?
I read everything that you read because we are a monoculture. So
here we go.
Elon Musk Twitter buyout. Tell me what's going on here.
Well, it looks like Elon Musk, as you said, is buying Twitter out.
Right, it's a self-evident.
Self-evident, yeah. Well, there's been kind of a lot of, I'd say, talk in the media and the headlines about these debates related to free speech, right? Where Elon Musk buying Twitter, some sides see it as the most disastrous thing that has ever happened to Western civilization. Others see it as a saving grace for rights to freedom of speech in this country.
Why do people see it as such a terrible event?
That's actually kind of interesting. You brought up a good point when we were talking about this offline, but it seems like a couple of months back, Elon Musk was generally seen as a savior by everybody. Oh, he's getting us to Mars. Oh, he's going to solve the climate crisis. But I think it's something specifically about Twitter as a platform. Him buying it is kind of unacceptable to certain circles because...
Hold on. Why did they villainize Elon Musk after, viewing him as a sort of hero? What happened to, create this transformation, to spark this transformation?
It appears to have on lead poisoning and the slow disintegration of everybody's brain cells.
That sounds about right.
That sounds about right. Well, no, in all seriousness, I think there is a fear that Elon's position he's taking on raising some of Twitter's existing restrictions on free speech. What we talked about in our first episode, right? Deplatforming individuals who spread misinformation, maybe flagging certain things as government associated media, so people have more of a balanced diet of information they take. I think there's a fear on one side that Elon's ownership will bring about an end to some of these restrictions and barriers.
Do you think realistically he's going to do that? If the outcry is large enough, then Twitter's not going to make as much money, right? If users leave Twitter, then, this is a catastrophic investment, right? And Twitter's, market share and market value is going to diminish significantly. Is he really going to make these massive changes? Is that really likely? If he lets Trump back on or something minor, people might throw a fit, but it's not really going to have a huge impact. I don't know. My guess is he's not gonna do a whole lot. I think he'll loosen up some restrictions, but at the end of the day, I don't think it's gonna make a huge difference. I think unless the entire capitalistic model changes, the entire incentives of media change.
Yeah.
How is it gonna change, right? Because in order for Twitter to compete with other social media, it has to make money, and it makes money through ads, through people looking at ads. So your attention, the way to gain people's attention as a platform is by constantly propping up, it's what the algorithms do. They prop up the most outrageous or controversial topics, right? And that's going to create, the same issues that social media has been creating for a while. That's my take.
I mean, I think you've kind of stumbled, I don't know if it's inadvertently or if you did this on purpose, but you kind of wandered into a pretty interesting scenario, right? Where you kind of identified the fact that profit is going to be the ultimate. That is a very loud mug. Over. That's it. Cut. No, joking. If profit is the ultimate driving force that keeps these organizations afloat, that kind of makes it very hard to take a stance on anything, right? And I'm not saying that Elon Musk's position is correct. And, I think it still remains to be seen exactly if this is going to be objectively a good or bad move. But you kind of pointed out the fact that the bottom line is they have to make sure advertisers stay on their platform, right? That means they're not going to be able to go against the grain, so to speak, in any matter out of fear of losing revenue. So that's a pretty dangerous situation because let's say that the market willed that we start censoring certain groups of people. Let's say for whatever reason, our capitalistic system determines that LGBTQ plus voices need to be silenced, right? Would Twitter silence those people if there was a risk of them losing money if they didn't follow suit with that? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's the market willing into existence a position, so to speak, which I think,
and it's it's kind of crazy because now what the market is willing is also determined by Twitter to some extent, by Twitter itself, by these social media companies, these news outlets as well, which is again incentivized by the capitalistic model for pure profit. Mm-hmm. So you're kind of in this loop where they are dictating the rules, the narratives, and it's kind of a vicious cycle, I guess.
Right, but back to maybe the original point we were discussing, it's also very interesting how overnight Elon's kind of position within, I don't know, what is it called? Like the zeitgeist has totally changed. Right now, he's kind of seen as this sort of nefarious, kind of bumbling individual that's getting in the way of, I guess what he's getting. That's the interesting thing about this issue. I think both sides of the argument are trying to make a claim towards some higher ideal, right? And it seems like free speech is being argued by both sides. Like one is saying that, I guess maybe it's the definition of how free speech should be enforced and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, the second he made an announcement that he's going to buy this platform, now all of a sudden he's become a hated figure.
Well, I think he was even villainized beforehand to some extent. It seems like it's gone through the roof now. I think, with COVID, he had some takes on COVID that was sort of controversial. Maybe it was, forcing his employees to work, during the pandemic. I don't know. I mean, look, Elon is by no stretch a perfect guy. It just seems a little strange from my point of view, and maybe I'm just completely ignorant, or I haven't really been kind of staying on top of things in terms of the news on him. But it seems like a relatively speaking, an overnight shift in how he's viewed. Right. And I think the most very strange, right?
The most irritating thing about this to me is that this is the issue that ultimately speaking leads people to change their opinion about Elon Musk. There is a multitude of other things in his background that should have been causing outrage and should have been causing this sort of like, oh my gosh, we need to challenge Elon Musk types of approaches, right? I mean, first and foremost, a couple maybe months back, maybe almost over a year ago at this point, I lost track of time, it's the pandemic, but there's the ProPublica investigation over what systems billionaires use to avoid paying taxes, right? And Elon Musk, along with Warren Buffett, Jeff Bezos, and I can't remember the other individual they profiled, but they were basically using these individuals as showpieces for how they dodge taxes, right? And I think the model they used is where they essentially borrow money against their total equity that they have, and then they don't actually have to pay taxes on it because they're not withdrawing. They're not selling any stock. They're not withdrawing any actual money. So, there's documented evidence that Elon Musk doesn't pay his fair share in taxes, right? There's all of the problematic nonsense that he does in terms of market manipulation that the SEC's on his ass about, for making certain claims about what Tesla can and can't do, or maybe, tweeting certain things that force Tesla's stock to go up, right? There's also his family history of, they're an apartheid era mining family, right? In South Africa. So all of these things have existed in his background this entire time. We've known exactly who he is, and nobody gave a shit. And then he tries to go buy Twitter. Now the outrage machine is starting up. And that to me is a little bit frustrating to see unfold.
Well, it's indicative of kind of like, again, the narratives that are either unfolding due to the nature of like social media algorithms online, or whether news outlets are like specifically dictating some of these narratives. Like why certain pieces of information about his background weren't revealed earlier on, and now they are. And I don't know. It's interesting, but it just says a lot about the current environment.
I think that this isn't really about morality or principle or whatever they're making it out to be. I think this is just an outrage machine.
Well, we're also always, to some extent, we're always dealing with incomplete information. And that's why being too convinced of something, being too committed to certain kind of views or ideas, it's really just like, it's a natural thing for humans, right? Mm-hmm. Because it shows like confidence. It shows like, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about. It gives you kind of a social benefit in terms of like status even. Mm-hmm. But it is toxic, really. It's a toxic way to go about things, because it's in some sense it's delusional, because you think you know more than you do. You're always dealing with incomplete information, and so you have to humble yourself and know that you could easily be wrong, and that's certainly not something in our society that's viewed. Not just in our society, in general, among humans, it's not something that's viewed favorably. Someone who's kind of like timid in terms of what they're saying, like, mm-hmm. well, maybe it's this or that. Like, no one's listening to that person. I'm saying this, and I still listen to people that speak, it's more appealing to listen to people that speak confidently, to speak like they know exactly what they're talking about, to speak like they have the complete picture. The
antithesis of who we are as podcasts. So.
Exactly. You could say that about us. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I feel like you always have to keep that in mind. And it's just not, again, it's just not part of human culture.
So what do you think, now that, it was announced that Twitter's accepted his offer and it looks like this deal is going to go through? Do you think that, what do you feel is going to be in hold for the future for Twitter as a platform? Do you actually feel like users are going to start dropping off? Are there committed enough individuals who will tweet outrage at Elon Musk buying Twitter and then actually go and delete their accounts afterwards?
It's going to take a lot for the user base to be significantly reduced. Mm-hmm. He would have to do something really ridiculous. I think there's going to be maybe some minor adjustments, but for the most part, things are going to just stay the same. Honestly.
You think he's going to bring back Trump?
I don't know. He may. Honestly, I don't think it's going to matter too much. Mm-hmm. Trump's still in the news constantly.
Right. Lives rent free. Yeah.
Yeah. I think he's, a total piece of shit that shouldn't have, like, in a perfect world, he doesn't have a single platform. He's rotting in a prison, in my opinion. Like that's what should be happening. Some complete. This guy's a complete cancer to society, in my opinion. And again, like I'm pretty. You could say I'm biased against Trump, but like, I don't know. He's proven to be quite a quite a asshole. But I mean, there's plenty of other people that would fall into that category, but he's definitely like he's most vocal about his shitty views, and I don't know. It's just toxic all around. So I don't know. I don't want to beat a dead horse here.
You know, I think I could hear our Republican subscriber base just. Oh wait, no, we didn't have any. No subscribers. I guess we can't. We don't have anything to lose at this time. Wonderful.
My bad, subscribers.
Subscriber.
Please, potential subscriber, come back.
Okay. We love you, Trump.
Yeah, so moving on to other pieces of news in this current events roundup episode, sponsored by Animal Crackers from Costco.
Kirkland Animal Crackers.
Johnny Depp.
Oh, shit, we're going to go there.
No, we're going to talk about the abortion thing that just happened.
Maybe to round out, there was a leak from the Department of Justice, from the Supreme Court a few days back. We got to start organizing these dates a little bit better. Really shooting from the hip here.
That's fine.
It's fine in the future. Anyways, there's a leak came out of the Supreme Court indicating that there might be a majority opinion forming that could jeopardize the continued existence of Roe v. Wade and protection of reproductive rights across the country at a federal level. Obviously, this has been a really hot issue ever since the Trump presidency. For 4 years, it seems like a lot of clinics where we live were shut down. And there was a constant narrative that, hey, this is something that's going to happen. And it looks like it's in motion. I don't think there's been a formal ruling yet. I haven't brushed up on the latest reporting on it today. But what are your thoughts, Devon? Are you surprised this is happening? Are you shocked that this kind of position is actually being taken by the Supreme Court?
I mean, we shouldn't be, because Trump appointed 3 judges. For everyone that said he was the same as Hillary, or the Democrats and Republicans are the same, looking at you, Andre.
Oh, piercing brown eyes.
I mean, there's clearly a lot of overlap between the political parties, between a lot of the corruption that occurs in Washington, etc. But there are some tangible differences, and this is one example. Like, this is what you get when you elect crazy Republicans. And not all Republicans, or not all, like, Republicans aren't crazy by necessity, it's not necessitated necessarily by a conservative ideology. Mm-hmm. It's just the current set of Republicans that we have, mm-hmm. in my opinion, are a bit deranged, or have just completely fallen into religious nuttery, etc. I mean, some of them aren't actually religious. They just, use religious people
as cudgels. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I shouldn't be surprised. I'm not that surprised it's happened, honestly. I think it's a step backward. There's no question about it. Like, to me, it's so obvious that this right belongs to the mother, right?
Right. Well,
that's it.
End
of story.
And I think it's kind of interesting because a lot of the arguments, I guess, against abortion are seemingly grounded in an argument of morality, right? Human life is sacred, therefore we can't be performing abortions. But I think that the arguments lack substance, because there is an abundance of evidence to suggest that we don't actually care about human life, especially if anti-abortion voices are almost in unison denying universal health care, or free public education. So it really seems like the claim is made that every life is sacred, but then once the life is produced, once a child is born, nobody gives a shit anymore, right? And I could almost, I do not support.
Why doesn't the fetus pull itself up by its bootstraps and avoid getting aborted?
By its little fetus straps, yeah. But what I was going to say is that I don't support this move at all. I think it's absolutely terrible and damaging to everybody's liberties, including men. And maybe there would be more substance to this argument if, in addition to banning abortions, you also provided everything that's feasible to sustain raising a life in today's day and age, right? So, okay, fine, you're going to ban abortions, but also introduce, universal parental leave, introduce paid education for children, completely financed and subsidized, after school care programs, daycare, right? But at this point, you're going to try to ban abortions, but then every parent's objectively fucked when they actually have to raise the kid.
Yeah, I mean, think about it this way. If the mother wants to abort, like, what do you want? Like, why do you as a society want, the kid to be born when the mother has decided it wants to abort? When the mother is basically saying, like, yeah, I don't want to, for whatever reason, like, they don't, like, why would the society want that?
Well, you can make an argument, I get, and this isn't, let's look at places like Russia, or I don't know, like what Armenia's demographics are dealing with, but a lot of post-Soviet states are experiencing net population declines, right? In theory, you can make the argument that, okay, we need to maximize reproduction of our population. I don't know, like, what I'm saying with that, but again, like, the argument that we're banning abortions because we want to increase birth rates in our country, that's also not valid, because it again rubs up against the fact that you're not making it easy for people to have children. I mean, think about how many people in, like, the millennials / like Gen Z circle, or I guess Gen Zers are able to have kids now, right? Yeah, getting old. But how many people are choosing not to have children because they're overburdened by student debt, or because they can't afford paying for
you're saying there's much better ways to go about trying to increase the reproduction rate.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe organize a framework for society in which somebody will not choose to abort a child. And again, like, this is the most maybe toxic element of this whole argument, is the fact that just because abortions are available, it doesn't mean they're being forced on anybody. It just means the choice is there, right? It means that if you should choose, for whatever, as you pointed out, for whatever rationale you have, you can get an abortion. But it's not being forced on anybody. And I think that if you were truly, quote unquote, pro-life, you would organize policy in a way that abortions wouldn't even be necessary, right? Because if everything's taken care of. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, someone getting an abortion means things did not go as planned. Yeah.
And to your point, the question of why, why would you try to ban this? I think it really just comes down to control. It doesn't really matter if it's life or death.
So when you say control, I mean, you're talking about political control.
Yeah.
Is it politicians on the right trying to appease religious voters? Like, what is driving this?
Look, and I think you had a valid point earlier about this being a key differentiator between left and right. But I will point out that we've had, 2 years of the Biden presidency now? They control executive. They control both branches of Congress. They could have codified Roe v. Wade as legislation by this point, but they didn't. And
so are they? Is that malicious or is that incompetence?
I think they just. I think they just don't give a shit. And I think this kind of, ultimately speaking, this issue rubs up against a greater conversation around how we view class in our society, right? Because if you're, I mean, we've talked about this before off mic, but it's not an accident that every single person sitting in Congress has a net worth over what you and I combined probably have. I think if you're wealthy,
me and you combined probably like 100x that.
Well, I have a very high esteem of your financial stats.
No, you're misguided.
Yeah. So anybody of a certain socioeconomic status, they're going to be able to get an abortion regardless if it's illegal or not illegal in this country. You could fly your mistress to Canada or to Europe. So ultimately speaking, this comes down to oppressing people who are going to be most at risk of being negatively impacted by this sort of policy.
Yeah. You're contributing to kind of, again, just poor social outcomes for the people that are in the worst positions socially, right?
Mm-hmm.
you're just making it worse and worse. I mean, it's really a disastrous decision. I think we, maybe said everything we need to so far on that subject. Maybe we can circle back to it at some point, dedicate an entire episode to abortion, because that hasn't been discussed enough these days. But moving on, to circle back to kind of our first point regarding Elon Musk's buyout of Twitter, and just how that relates to news media in general, and how we get information.
Right.
I want to ask a broader question about if there's any potential for us to construct news media within capitalistic societies in a way that is not toxic for society. And what I mean by that is not incentivized by profit. Because if you think about it, like profit, if that's your main motive, then your main motive by definition isn't the well-being of the society, the best kind of the best way to distribute the information, the best way to present the information, right? It's about, how do I present this information to gain the biggest audience and to gain, the highest ad revenue possible. Like so long as we live in a capitalistic system and news media is incentivized purely by profit, is there a way that we can have news media that isn't as polarizing, that isn't as toxic?
I guess, like, what's the alternative, right? If it's state-controlled media, what's the incentive there? What's the incentive to, if truth is sacrificed for the sake of profit in a capitalist-driven environment for media production, what is it under state control, right? Is it possible to maintain impartiality if your major source of funding is coming from the government? Would you criticize the government? Would you...
So the BBC is an example.
The BBC's a shit show.
Yeah. But is it worse than CNN or Fox News?
It's probably the same quality. Objectively speaking, I think, and this is something that I talk to other people about a lot, I don't think any news outlet is objectively bad. There's probably some that produce more relevant investigations and spend more time actually investing into quality reporting, but every news outlet puts out good stuff at some point, right? Even the Washington Post, the Bezos Post, published a lot of really important articles during the investigations into the war in Afghanistan. Well, we're scraping the bottom of the barrel here. Anyways, those animal crackers must be good. So I think in the current system, we do have definitely a toxic way by which information is exchanged, but I think maybe there is a chance to kind of maintain a level of impartiality, right? You're able to actually, maybe critically examine certain issues without fear of political reprisal, which actually, as I'm saying it out loud, I think our system is totally morphed into something of the opposite of what was intended. I don't think we have. Do you think we have a free press right now in the current way things are organized?
It depends on what you mean by free. I think, look, you could start a news website right now, right? And you're free to post whatever you want on there. Now, you might not have a big audience, but that's, in a broad sense, we have a free press. In practice, it's controlled by, a select few who dominate these media companies.
Right. I think it's also important to note then who works at these media companies. I read a great article, I forgot where, but it was talking about the death of working class journalism, right? Where, let's say, before Watergate, journalism was largely defined as a trade, where you didn't have to go to a university to get a degree in journalism to work at your town paper, you would, look at the way Ernest Hemingway never had a college degree. He, showed up to the Kansas City Star and he worked as a cub reporter. They trained him up and eventually he had enough, stylistic knowledge to work as a reporter. After Watergate, journalism became like a glamorous profession, right? Where it was sort of attached to this kind of like, almost like a symbolic figure of American truth and whatnot. And because of that, it started becoming a prestigious profession. All of a sudden, people going to Harvard, Yale, Georgetown, George Washington were going to, newly constructed journalism programs to go work at the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. But what it created was kind of an imbalance in the market where all of a sudden the people that are staffing these newspapers are from the same socioeconomic class as the individuals they're supposed to be holding accountable for how society should be organized in a democratic system, right? So I guess the ultimate question is, if somebody has a lot more in common with, let me rephrase that, if a reporter for the Washington Post has a lot more in common with the politician they're supposed to be investigating than they do with somebody who's reading the Post in a small town in Iowa, are they going to be accurately reflecting information? Are they going to criticize their own socioeconomic class? And I think it is about class ultimately, because if you look at the prestigious credentials necessary to work at some of the top publications, you have to go to one of the big schools, right? But who can afford to pay $50,000, $60,000 a year for a Columbia journalism degree while living in New York City?
So are you advocating that we put a class limit on it?
You can only hire 2 rich people. No, I think there needs to be a way, and I'm not saying, I don't know enough about the media culture in the United States historically, right? But I think there needs to be a way to return towards a local level of media production where it's not the New York Times that is seen as a source of ultimate truth, but a paper that exists within your community, right? And that might be the best way.
So you want to localize truth,
right?
Insofar as truth exists.
Precisely.
Which, we're not talking about. No one has the objective truth, right? There is an objective truth about everything,
right?
But we don't really have access to that.
Right.
But you're saying by localizing it, it can be more relevant and more, just more balanced for, someone in a given area, right? Like it can retain, it can be more like an authentic kind of presentation of reality insofar as that's possible.
Right.
That's what you're saying.
Who else can present reality authentically than a source, a media outlet that exists within the reality it's reporting on? If you look at major newspapers that existed in the Midwest historically, a lot of them are being shuttered or bought up by massive conglomerates. And a lot of the local media that does exist, maybe outside of TV stations, are these sorts of like nonprofit conglomerates that are being popped up in partnership with things like Report for America and whatnot, right? But it's not the powerhouse that it used to be. And if you don't have outlets that are covering issues that are happening within an immediate community, you lose that kind of source of real truth, quote unquote, because New York or Washington-based newspaper isn't going to have the resources or the real care to cover stories that are breaking on the ground in Montana.
So let me ask you this: from a human nature standpoint, is it possible for us to pay attention to local news more than we are going to the kind of like the national news? Because with the way things are trending, especially since the advent of the internet and social media, I mean, we're becoming less and less local. Which I get it. That's what you're saying. Like, that's part of the problem. Mm-hmm. But that's the trend. Everything is gravitating towards, the most important political figures are like the president and senators, representatives. Right. The most important, athletes or the most well-known athletes, like you don't know anyone even locally, right? It's all about like the best basketball player is, worldwide known. Like it's going to be like someone like LeBron James, because the whole world is looking at the top of the top, right? And for something like basketball, right, that's like LeBron James in America, because the American, league is the best in the world, right? And so it's the same with musicians, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's always, usually when it comes to like things like music and at least some sports, it's like the top American athlete, right? In like baseball, basketball, and soccer, obviously it's different. But you get my point. Everything is gravitating towards
right
the top. How do you change that so that the landscape isn't like a view of like Egypt, where you have just this pyramid and like the only focus is on the top of the pyramid? How do you create a landscape of like smaller pyramids?
Right. And what you're saying makes perfect sense, right? That just the way that things are published on the internet, it's always going to be at the highest level, especially from like a political standpoint. Almost all politics, what's the phrase? All politics are national at this point, where even people running for state Senate offices or state House of Representatives, they're going to be bringing up issues that are happening at a federal scale. Look at how the parties have evolved at a state level, where you're very much either pro or anti-Trump. You should be talking about filling potholes and fixing bridges in your communities, but you're talking about these national tier figures, because that's how the political game's been shaped up. And I think that goes back to what you were originally talking about, where because of how the media industry has evolved and how these algorithms work and how the what generates profit, because this is it is a business to a certain extent, and what makes money is going to be these stories that are breaking at the national level. And until that changes, I don't think we're going to be able to kind of shift our focus naturally to.
But so do you have it backwards though? Is it because so money's driving like the focus, or is it the people's focus is driving what the money is kind of people's focus in certain subjects is what drives like the financial component, right? Because that you have to sell ads. So like, is it, like which one is it, right?
Maybe it's like a chicken and an egg situation, right?
Or maybe it's just a self-reinforcing loop.
Right. I guess the question is, do you think that people just aren't interested in what's happening in their communities?
I think so. I think it's because if you think of, okay, I'm going to just say, I'm going to go back to the evolutionary kind of historical anthropological example of you're in a tribe of like 50 people, right? Okay. If you have a main tribe leader that's kind of like the president of the tribe, and like my level of like research on this, like I could be full of shit right now. But I think generally like humans are hierarchical species. So, there's usually one guy at the top, right? So for every tribe, they're probably going to have like a leader. Now you might have kind of like, some additional sub leaders, right? And it'll be interesting to know like what happens between them. But at the end of the day, the biggest news is always going to be like, hey, our leader, right, our main leader decided like, people, this group is going to get less food next time there's a kill, right? Or these guys have to do something else to justify their, belonging to the group, right? So like the biggest news comes from the top. So the focus is always going to be on the top, right? It has to be that way. You would be kind of a dumb animal, right? If you didn't consider what the leader was saying and you were more focused on what someone at your level was saying, right? Well, or someone who has little influence, right? If you're focusing on someone who has little influence, like you're kind of missing the picture here. You want to listen to the most important person, right? I think that's a pretty like uncontroversial statement. That's why we evolved the way we did. That's the same way other primates function, right? Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, what if you look at it from a sense of being able to exert control, right? Very seldom, at least maybe on a personal level, do I feel like I have any control over what happens at, let's call it like the national level of politics. You know, the defense budget is what it is. You know, we are making a lot of choices in terms of how we intervene on a foreign level, what sorts of alliances we're part of, what sorts of military conflicts we're supporting or not supporting. That all seems very much outside of the bounds of my immediate range of control. But what I do have control over is like the potholes on the street next to us, or on which building codes are being approved for construction in the city. From an evolutionary standpoint, wouldn't I gravitate to something that I could immediately impact? That I could immediately use to address the quality of life that I have?
No. I mean, there's a mismatch in the environments, right? So the evolutionary environment, the one under which we adapted and evolved, was a small community. So everything that you're kind of taking in terms of, like, if you want to call it news, gossip, whatever, that's all relevant and actionable to you because the community is small enough. But in modern day societies, because there's such a massive mismatch between our environment, our ancestral environment, and the modern day environment, you are still focusing on, you know, the top of the hierarchy,
right? As
you should. You know, if the group was small, the problem is there's millions and billions of us. That's the problem. So I think it's very difficult to take the focus from the top to the you know, closer to the bottom where it's more local. Is it an educational problem? Can we say, hey, yeah, you know, we get it. Like, this is more interesting to pay attention to, like, presidential debates and all this stuff. Like, it's, you know, it's like a reality show. Obviously, it's very interesting, but you're only going to have a real impact if you start, you know, kind of bottom up at the local level. That's where you can have real influence.
Did you have a local civics class when you were in school?
No.
Same. I think we had a couple of weeks of like state tier politics, but it was very, very limited. I think that's kind of, ultimately speaking, maybe the issue we're rubbing up against.
But do you think that's enough? I mean, that's kind of the question I'm trying to pose to you. Like, is it just a matter of education, or is this so intrinsic to human nature, this focus on the top of the hierarchy, that even, you know, simply educating people out of it is not really a solution? Like, that's a question for many topics, right? Like, can you just educate your way out of the problem?
Well, I think we're focused on the top of the hierarchy. Let's call it the national level of things, because that's what's being offered to us. Because we're not investing into building maybe habits to try to seek out and understand the world that we immediately occupy, right? I'd think that if there was a greater emphasis in the public school system on, again, like learning about local politics, what it means to be, you know, a citizen of a city, and if there was a greater emphasis on this, there'd be more of an interest simply because you'd know what to look for. I think maybe we have back to my point about control, maybe paradoxically, we feel maybe a greater sense of control over these national issues because we're fairly well informed on them. Even if we have limited, you know, critical thinking about certain issues, those are the issues we're thinking about the most, right? But I couldn't tell you how potholes get fixed or who I have to call to get a pothole fixed because nobody ever taught me. And maybe that's what the solution is to a certain extent, is that by incorporating that into the period of education everybody goes through, there will be a greater interest in learning more about how these issues are being influenced by the politics at the local or regional.
But then, you know, I mean, to follow up on that, like, are potholes ever going to be as interesting, right? Or that's what I'm saying. Like, you know, by nature, we like to compare human beings, right? I mean, this is in every domain when it comes to, like, you know, you're comparing, like, you know, the woman you're with other women, you're friends with other friends, how much money you're making compared to other people. Like, we're a very comparative
it's because we're competitive. I think
we're competitive, but we also, therefore compare by our nature. And so if you're comparing the significance of local elections, say, versus like national elections, I mean, yes, you can argue like local elections are more relevant to you, but if your world, instead of being a small tribe, right, in, some region in West Africa, is actually the entire world with billions of people, and you're in the country, for example, that's the most powerful in the world, the USA, arguably, are you not going to focus on the more significant thing, which is the federal election, right? Like,
and I imagine the federal election in the USA still makes headlines in Ethiopia on a regular basis. I think the fact that it's kind of like a superpower trap that we fall into, because, I mean, it's changing. I think that not to get into like deep geopolitics, but I think that we're witnessing the retraction of kind of complete U.S. domination on the global stage. But everybody talks about the U.S. Everybody's interested in what happens in the U.S. Presidential elections in the U.S. become monumental for all countries to follow and track. And maybe in a way that kind of trickles down to how we think about it too, right? Of course we're going to be looking at these things because that's what everybody's looking at. And maybe that's the evolutionary piece of it, where it's kind of a self-perpetuating loop in the sense of this is what we follow because that's what everybody follows.
But then you can ask, like, why did people start following that?
Because I think you have something that you can ultimately speak and connect with somebody on. Because if you only focus on your own local issues, if we just only exclusively like consume media that was for this city, then how would we find ways to interact with people who are from other cities?
So you're proposing that as we became less localized and more kind of international, not just international, I mean like things became more nationalized. People started to meet and travel, people from other areas.
Right.
This desire or utility of like having knowledge about a common thing, right, at a higher level became more relevant and desirable. I mean, that's interesting. I don't know.
Maybe. I mean, it's not like we follow the news closely of what's happening in Spain or in other countries, but
well, they don't have influence, right? They don't have the same level of influence, I mean, as the US. So like if you have limited time, like why would you follow Spanish politics?
Well, we don't follow politics in China either. China's quite an influential country.
That's a really good point. I don't know. I don't have the evolutionary expertise to go back in time and
maybe it's also a question of language access, right? Where English is still the lingua franca. Most people still study English as a second language in their schools, so they can access English language information easily. Mandarin or Cantonese aren't quite. I mean, I suspect in the future they probably will become more relevant languages on a global scale. But it's easier to access information coming out of the U.S., especially if you speak English.
What if we just have room for only like the most influential piece of information in a given like category, right? Or like that's really what we care about, because
just like the news, nothing.
Yeah, I mean, like we don't follow Chinese politics to the same extent, but China is still a relevant.
Yeah.
Like I mean, it's a relevant point of discussion. Like in presidential elections, like it's not like we ignore it.
And
it's just
if there were an earthquake in China tomorrow, that would still be front page news because China is such a major, economic force, and it would impact everybody in that sense.
Right. If in the same, same if there was some huge economic development in China, or they had some massive change in relations between Russia or something. So I mean, we do follow them to a certain extent, but yeah, it's significantly less than U.S. politics, which is who knows? Maybe we should just follow Chinese politics, given how toxic U.S. politics are. Do you think it's more or less toxic down there?
I think it's a human thing. I think China has its own toxic political bullshit they deal with. Universal. We're not a unique brand.
We're not unique?
Yeah,
I'm not unique.
You don't even exist, man.
Don't tell me that, man. You know what that does to me. Don't get this beautiful mind spinning. Is this our cue?
I think it's our cue. I think the brain's been fried.
Yeah, well, I hope everyone has enjoyed this episode. It's a bit of a kind of a rough one, I guess, in some ways.
Going back to our roots.
Yeah. Yeah, so everybody have a good one. Or something. How do you end podcasts?
I think you just end them.
Like I just click this record button?
That's it. 3, 2, 1, and death.